Welcome to everyone joining us for this. What is this? The fifth session, the fifth installment of our course on the history of Zionism. It's good to have all of you here on this wonderful night. We're going to start, as always, with a very short, maybe we can call it a meditation or just a recentering. So just close your eyes for a moment and just connect with your breath. Just bring awareness to what is here for you, how you're showing up in this moment. And inviting to this space energies of shalom. Shalom means peace, of course, but it also means harmony. It means wholeness. And we invite those energies as we come together in this learning experience. So take a breath for shalom. יהיו לרצון אמרפי והגיון ליבי לפניך, Adonai. Holy One, help us to know your presence in this space, in this moment, across space and across time. That the words of our mouths, the meditations of our hearts might flow from the fullness of your being. Adonai Tzuri v'Go'ali, Eternal One, help me to remember that you are that source, that ground. You are the shape of me. And you are that force within me, calling me to awaken. Amen. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, so I'd like to start immediately with returning us after the last few sessions of trying to paint maybe the psychological portrait of those who came to the Promised Land. Now back onto the tracks, the unfolding tracks of history. And we pick up where we left off, and the year is 1914. 1914. I think if I were to give a title to this session, I think it would be something like The Land That Was Promised Too Many Times. But what we have to do in order to understand Palestine during the 4 years of World War I, which is what we're going to cover at breakneck pace tonight, 4 years in an hour and a half. What we have to do to understand Palestine during these 4 years between 1914 and 1918 is to do a little bit of geopolitical mapping, because maybe not all of us remember those those classes back in middle school or high school about World War One. So let's try to see what was going on at the time. So the war itself, for those of us who don't exactly remember, is going to pit what was called the Central Powers at the time in that war, which were Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, against the Allies, same name as in the Second World War. And the Allies at the time were France, the British Empire, Russia, Italy, Japan, and toward the end of the war, the United States of America. These were the great powers that were engaged in that war. And if you remember from long ago history class, that war really mostly took place in a very small land that delineated Germany from France. It was the war of the trenches, and where millions of soldiers on both sides perished. It was the war where the first, armored vehicle were created. It was the first time that there were airplanes that participated in the war. It was also a war that saw gassing the opponent was still allowed at the time. It was a really horrific war. So that is what was going on at the time. The Ottoman Empire, who was one of the central powers warring against the rest of the world, the Ottoman Empire had been shrinking over the last few decades. Through the 19th century, the 1800s, because that century was the century of the great Western European empires. That was the time of the era of colonization, where amongst other continents, Asia, Africa became divided between the great European powers. By the time the war broke out, the Ottoman Empire had lost Morocco and Algeria to the French, lost Tunisia to the Italians, and lost Egypt, including the Sinai Peninsula, to the British Empire. So if we were to map it according to today's map of the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire had shrunk to what we would understand today to be Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar in the eastern part of the empire, Lebanon, what would be today Israel, and Jordan in the west, and the entire Arabian Peninsula, Red Sea coast down to the Gulf of Aden. And this area that I'm describing now, the west coast of Arabia, basically, included the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So what I want to do, because there were a lot of names and geography here, is maybe quickly share my screen to show you what I mean by how the empire had shrunk. So let's see if this is gonna work. There we go. I'm hoping everybody can see this. So what you see, we're just going to look. See, I think you can see my cursor. Um, the area I'm talking about is Turkey, the darkest green, and a shade a little less dark that includes Syria and Iraq, just below Turkey, going down through all the Mesopotamia there, all the way down to Kuwait, and even farther down Qatar. And then next to Syria, you have what's known to be Lebanon today, Palestine slash Israel, most of Jordan. And then what I was talking about, that's that dark green, well, not as dark as Turkey, but that dark green piece of land next to the Red Sea that includes Medina and Mecca. Right? That was in 1914 the extent of the remaining Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Make sure everybody remains muted. I hope that was helpful. You will get this map as part of the reading packet coming to you tomorrow, so you'll have more time to explore what I'm talking about. So, but that exactly was what remained in 1914 of the Ottoman Empire. And this last part that I was talking about, so the part that was on the Arabian Peninsula that I was mentioning on the map, that strip of land that one got along the coast of the Red Sea, right, all the way basically from Jordan and Israel today, all the way down through the peninsula, almost to the actually all the way to the very end, and the Gulf there, the Gulf of Aden, the passage there, that is a very critical geographical part that belonged to the Ottoman Empire. It was critical to the British Empire. So the British Empire had Egypt, right, and Sinai, which gave it access to the Red Sea. And the British Empire took over Egypt because they needed to make sure they had control of the Suez Canal in Egypt that linked the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Why? Why was that so critical to the British Empire to have control over the Suez Canal? Because it was through the Suez Canal that they connected to the crown jewel of the empire, which was India. Without the canal, without the ability of ensuring safe trade routes from basically from England through Gibraltar, through the Mediterranean Sea, the Suez Canal, and all the way to India, they would lose the ability to protect India and to not only supply India but also extract all that they were extracting from their colony there, and transport all the goods from India back to England. So for England, for the British Empire, the Suez Canal was critical, which is why they took Egypt. But they were concerned, as you can imagine, that the Ottoman Empire ruling over basically the entire eastern coast of the Red Sea could create great disturbance to the shipping route of their naval forces and their freight towards India. So it's very important as we look at the geopolitical context of the war, especially when it's going to come to influence what is going to happen through those 4 years in Palestine, to understand what the war really was about in that part of the world. Britain needed to control the canal, and they needed to keep the Red Sea free of attacks in order to maintain their vast empire. It was really critical to them. Another piece of information that is very important in understanding this part of world history is to remember and keep in mind that Ottoman Turks of the Ottoman Empire were Sunni Muslims, but they were not Arabs, right? Remove the Sunni Muslim connection between them and the Arabs who came from the Arabian Peninsula, right? It's a little bit of the same separation, though difference because they're different sects, religious sects, that Iranian Muslims and Arab Muslims, fight over today, right? Iranians are Muslims, but they're Shiite Muslims. They're Persian, so they don't even speak Arabic, right? Which is very different from the Arab Muslims that speak Arabic but are Sunni Muslims. Ottoman Muslims were not Arabs. They didn't speak Arabic either. They were Sunni Muslim, the same as the Arabs, but they were a different nation, a different group of people, if you will, and that's going to be very important. It's going to set up a different, as we'll see, different allegiances as the war breaks out within the Ottoman Empire, and it's going to deeply influence the outcome of the war and ultimately what will happen with Palestine, with a promised land. And what's most important for us to keep in mind is that Ottoman rule, though Muslim, wasn't always welcomed by the local Arab populations of the empire, and we'll see how that is gonna impact the war. All right, so kind of laying the ground here, I think it's important to understand what everyone was looking at on the maps, what they needed for themselves, and what also was going on within each part, to see how all the pieces will move during the war. So as I said, as the war breaks out, the Ottoman Empire aligns itself with the Central Powers, and so Great Britain feels it to be a great threat to its plan, both because of Suez Canal and its ability to navigate the Red Sea, and the concerns with cutting the main artery of its empire to India. And the British Empire really quickly understood, and rightfully so, that the Arab population of the Ottoman Empire might not have particularly liked or be very fond of Istanbul's rule over them. And though they might still side with their Muslim brothers over the British infidels, if the Sultan called for jihad against them, and obviously other allied countries. So that was really for the British Empire, understanding that even though the Arabs inside the Ottoman Empire might not really like their rule, the rules of the Turks over them, they might still side with them in a case of a call of jihad from the Sultan in Istanbul. And if that was going to be the case, as the war breaks out, it could really endanger their position in Egypt, for sure, because Egypt could be overrun by the Arab forces, therefore destroying their hold on the Suez Canal and the problems that would cause for the empire, especially with India. But also, it could bring to revolt or to conflict the Muslims of what we call today Pakistan. Right? There was a huge Muslim population, part of their Indian Pakistani empire, and if the Sultan in Istanbul were to call for a jihad, there was a real risk that the Muslims in Pakistan would rise up against the empire as well and open yet another front for them in the war. So something to also consider, that definitely the British forces, the British armies considered a great threat to them. Now, as the war breaks out and things begin to take shape, a really fascinating character enters the scene. His name is Sharif Hussein of Mecca. He is the king of Hijaz. What is the kingdom of Hijaz? Well, the kingdom of Hijaz is exactly that strip of land that I insisted on defining for you, that goes along the eastern shore of the Red Sea, right? And he's the king ruling over this area. Hussein was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and as such, he was not just the king of Hijaz, he was also the guardian of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina that sat, in fact, in his kingdom. He became, as you can imagine, of great interest to the British Empire as a potential ally to, in fact, secure for them or maintain for them quite a peace in this area. Again, because of the shipping route that the canal and the Red Sea were for them. And Sharif Hussein of Mecca knew that and understood that as well. To understand, Sharif Hussein of Mecca was king. He was a descendant of Muhammad. He was the guardian of the holiest city of Islam. And therefore, as you can imagine, he was probably, beside the Sultan in Istanbul, the most influential and powerful Arab leader of the time. And he too was very worried that the war might force a British invasion of his kingdom at worst, and at best could cut him off from the rest of the Arab world through the potential blockade that could bring his regime, his kingdom, to its knees. But really, he was really concerned that those unbelievers, Christian British armies, could come into possession of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And because Great Britain needed his power, his great influence on the Arab world, they needed him as an ally. They thought that they could use him and use his prestige as a great voice in Islam to counter a possible jihad call by the Ottomans. In addition, Hussein on his side came to see Britain as a possible partner better than the Ottoman Empire to gain Arab independence post-war, when he seems that he had not been able to do that or advocate for that with the Ottoman Empire. And so for him, he thought that maybe if he were to be on the good side of the British Empire, maybe they would be more willing to allow an Arab independent state to be created in the Middle East, free of Ottoman rules. So you see how important this character is going to be, and you also see how the British forces and Hussein might have had a lot in common as the war begins. And we'll see how that will unfold in just a moment. So, the war breaks out. The Ottoman Empire enters the war November 5th, 1914. And just as Britain feared and predicted, the Sultan does indeed call for a jihad and demand that Hussein be in lockstep with them and issue his own fatwa against the infidels. The Hussein is going to be very diplomatic. He's going to be placating the Sultan by privately agreeing to do what the Sultan is asking, but really never actually, in fact, publicly calls for a fatwa or for jihad himself. He keeps saying yeah to the Sultan, but he never actually publicizes anything in support of the Sultan. Instead, just a few months into the war, by July of 1915, he begins a lengthy correspondence with Sir Henry McMahon, who was at the time the British governor of Egypt. And he, in the letters, the series of letters that unfold, he tries to negotiate with Britain a treaty, an agreement between them that the British Empire, with the end of the war and assuming that they would be victorious, would commit to Arab independence and to setting up an Arab state in that part of the world, in the Middle East. And in return, he pledges to McMahon, to the British forces, that he will lead an Arab revolt within and against the Ottoman Empire, kind of a fifth column inside of the empire through the war. I'm just making sure everybody's muted because I'm hearing an echo.
I'm muting mine.
Thank you. Please, everybody stay muted. So,
Listen to this because it's
okay, somebody still. Thank you for that. I have actually found online and included in your readings tomorrow. As you know, I'm trying to share with you as many original sources as I can come across from all of this. And I have found actually these original fascinating letters. The whole series of them. There were maybe a dozen short letters, obviously, and they will be as part of the course pack, posted tomorrow. And you will see how fascinating these are as they were happening. It's quite astonishing to read what they were writing to each other. I found that out of, I think it's a college or a university. And I think, if I remember correctly, their translation, the date is incorrect. But you will see those great letters. See how first of all, see what they were saying to each other, and I would bring to your attention, especially, I hope you remember this by tomorrow, but by the time you read the document, to me, one of the most interesting and maybe crucial to the unfolding history of Zionism and the Middle East in general is the second response from McMahon. I don't exactly know how to pronounce his name. Mahon, McMahon. We're going to go with that. Dated October 24th, 2015. It's the letter that is going to be number 4 in the series. You'll see that after like an early back and forth in the first letters, the British governor of Egypt seems to pledge in that letter to give the Arab independence in most of the Arab Middle East. But then he's making a few exceptions, right? And we'll talk more about that next week, but there's a lot of controversy from those letters, whether he in fact promised what the Arabs will say he promised. Again, I said the title of this session is the land that was promised too many times, right? Did he actually say that he would see to a future Arab caliphate that included all of the Middle East, or did he make exceptions? And did these exceptions actually exclude Palestine? It seems that maybe he wasn't promising everything. It seems that he was saying that all of the Middle East may become an independent Arab caliphate, except for the lands bordering the Mediterranean Sea. And if that was the case, and that's the point of view he's going to defend even after the war, that would include, all of Lebanon and all of Palestine. And the controversy is really going to revolve around one word, which is the word vilayet in Arabic, that could either mean town, city, village, or an entire region. And on this word, basically, the controversy revolves, especially because that was not a word that was understood in the Ottoman language. So it was not a word that was technically existing in the official administrative language of the Ottoman Empire. So, it's quite interesting, because the British Empire is going to say, no, we never promised the entirety of anything. We always reserve the right to keep the the Mediterranean coast under our rule. And the Arabs will say, well, but if you understand the word vilayet this way, then it actually means that what you excluded was only Lebanon and from Lebanon up to Turkey, but you didn't exclude Palestine. So Palestine should be included in the Arab Caliphate, and so went the controversy. There is another map that I'm going to share it with you as well right now. A map that was actually drawn from the British perspective, right? As the British understanding of their response, of MacMahon's response to in those letters. So here is the map. Let me just take a second to share my screen once again. I have to look for the map. Just give me a second. I have it right here. I hope. Let's see. Is it right here? There it is. It's also going to be included in the packet. So now let me do a share screen. There you go. So what I need you to look at, I think hopefully everybody can see this, is the dotted line, right? The dotted line. That was the line that, according to the British account, right? The text is Britain's promise to the Arabs in 1915, right? In those letters, this was the line that, according to the British version of the letters, was what they meant. And you see how far down it goes. It goes underneath the Dead Sea, and beneath Be'er Sheva, already inside of the Negev. What the Sheriff of Mecca, what the Sheriff Hussein is going to say, is that no, the only part that you excluded was what's grayed out, the Vilayet of Beirut and the Vilayet of Aleppo. That's what they say they understood the letters to mean. And if that was the case, then this northern part and all of basically Palestine was supposed to be under their potentially under their rule, right? So fascinating twists in history, maybe, I don't know, but something that you will be able to look at more closely when you get everything in the mail. And those of you who will take this course many years from now, it'll be included right there. So, this is the controversy. We'll see that historically, ultimately, it would make no difference. But that was one of the controversies that broke out in those days, specifically post-war, and we'll see what happens with that. Scholars would actually weigh more on the side of the British version because, since what was most important to the empire was to preserve maritime travel and the ability of their navy to roam the seas unencumbered, that it would make absolute sense for them to actually understand and propose a deal that would allow them to keep the hold on and possession of all the coastal territories. We'll see also that Britain was seeking to keep, like, even the port of Haifa and Jaffa were key to them, because ultimately they had a vision to create a railway that would actually cross completely through the Middle East all the way to Kuwait, basically, and from there open yet another maritime route through the Persian Gulf this time, not the Red Sea, but the Persian Gulf, in order to also to have like to duplicate basically what they had through the Red Sea with the Persian Gulf, in order to connect to the Indian colonies. So scholarly, it would make much more sense that what maybe clumsily, but I don't know, not explicitly, the British were offering Hussein, but it would make much more sense for them to keep a hold of the coastal lands. Also, the British were seeking an additional buffer beyond the Sinai Peninsula to protect the Suez Canal and ensure undisturbed maritime traffic, both in that part of the Mediterranean, because that's where the ships were coming to the Suez Canal, and also to protect the canal itself. So strategically, it would make much more sense for the British to have excluded that part of the land for their own purpose, rather than include it in what they were offering Hussein. Nevertheless, the controversy was there, and after the war, the Arabs and Hussein and the Arabs claimed that Palestine was indeed promised to them. And even if he did, which can be debated ad nauseum, the letters themselves, you will read them, the letters themselves were really a series of secret back and forth, secret correspondence that was never made public. So there were interesting letters, but they did not amount to an official signed treaty or an official document, that Hussein could have, as we say, take to the bank and demand, post-war to be ratified, to be followed through. So the truth of the matter, actually, that the British public didn't hear about those letters at all until 1939, before the Second World War. That was the first time that they were translated and published in British newspapers that year. So really no one knew about this until 25 years later. So though he didn't have a real treaty in hands, Hussein nonetheless, since it was his part of the bargain, following the letters, wanting to make good on his part, and in fact led an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during the war. And you know about this because you know the famous story of T.E. Lawrence, most famously known as Lawrence of Arabia. And if you know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, then you know exactly the story of this revolt that I am talking about. You also probably know that the revolt was only able to rally barely some 3,000 men to its cause. And that's really at most. Overwhelmingly, the Muslim Arabs remained absolutely steadfastly loyal to the Ottoman Sultan, including, as you will read this week in the Sacha chapter, including the Arab population of Palestine. And that, the fact that the Arab population of Palestine remain loyal to the Sultan and to the Ottoman Empire will have dire consequences for the Jews of Palestine, as you will read, and maybe I'll mention if I have time still right now. So not one Arab of Palestine joined the revolt. Now, before I close this chapter of the history of the First World War as it pertains to the Middle East, it is interesting that Hussein's one of his sons, Abdullah, he had the two main sons that he have were Faisal, Feisal, and Abdullah, and they both will lead the revolt. Abdullah especially will lead a lot of the battles that they were involved in. And Abdullah was Abdullah, and Faisal and Hussein were of the Hashemite family. And Abdullah eventually was made the emir of Transjordan, the part of the land that will become Jordan in modern days. Which is, it's very interesting to notice. I'm going to talk in a little bit, or maybe next week, we'll see about how the French and British Empire literally drew lines in the sand to create Arab states in that part of the world, and literally installed whatever family they thought would benefit them to rule the locals in those newly created state, and made an absolute mess of the Middle East because of that. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. And yet, still connected to that part of the history, there is another Arab family at the time that started to go to war inside the Arabian Peninsula, and eventually, after the end of the First World War, in early 1920, that family and its leader Ibn Saud, who came from Central Arabia, is going to wage war against Hussein and the Hashemite family, and in fact will be victorious in that war and capture the kingdom of Hejaz and transform the Arabian Peninsula into and give its name, the family of their name, to the Arabian Peninsula. Ibn Saud now turns the Arabian Peninsula into the Saudi Arabia. And that's actually part of some of those wars that started to fester in that part of the world that really is going to change the Middle East and the world in and of itself. And so the kingdom of Hejj, where Hussein came from, and then Abdullah and Faisal, is going to disappear, and you're going to see his sons, Abdullah and Faisal, actually become kings of other parts of the Middle East that didn't exist at the time that Hussein was writing letters to the British Empire. It's very fascinating to see how that part of the world was shaped 100 years ago in all of those kinds of ways. So it's historically interesting to note that this Hashemite family from Arabia, from the Arabian Peninsula, is being transposed post-war by the ruling now the British armies to rule over other countries, especially Jordan and Syria, and we'll see what happened with Iraq, and because they repeated this mistake, the British forces, the British armies, the British leadership repeated these mistakes over and over again all over the Middle East. And you know, those of us who are aware of these unfoldings of histories, of these devastating decisions from the British Empire, you know, we understand better the long, protracted civil war that has devastated Syria in this past many years now, and why al-Assad and the Assad family, who originally does not belong to that part of the world, they were imported there, had, as we saw, very little remorse in bombing and gassing his own Arab population, killing massacres hundreds of thousands of his citizens, and forcing millions into exile. And this has happened right there in our face, and it's still happening. And we have seen no campus demonstration against those hundreds of thousands of women, children, men, women, children, elderly, bombed to smithereens over the last few years. No one has demonstrated on campus. No one has put posters up to condemn Assad. No one has tweeted any kind of video. There has been no action taken, no speech of any kind in solidarity with this local indigenous Arabs. In fact, those who have attacked Israel have stolen footage of Assad's carnage in Aleppo, for example, and have passed it along as being Israel's strikes on Gaza, using the footage of Assad's devastation and pinning it on Israel. So, you know, it's interesting how easy it is for the horrors perpetrated on one people to be erased and used as propaganda against another people, while at the same time never lifting a finger in denouncing the Assad regime for his genocide of its own people. I'm closing the parenthesis here, but it's all part of what we're seeing in the world today, and so it needs to be mentioned, I think. Back to our story. Britain is really unimpressed, let's say, to use a PC kind of word, by its Arab allies, very unimpressed with the Arab revolt that doesn't really amount to anything ultimately, but reassured that because of that tacit agreement with Hussein, at least through the war, the corridor of the Red Sea would remain undisturbed by the war. And so, reassured by that fact, Britain is able to push forward with its own armies to achieve its second goal, which was now to secure this additional territorial buffer beyond the Sinai Peninsula to protect the Suez Canal. And so, by 1915 and 16, Great Britain had all but really completely forgotten the Hussein-McMahon letters, and in fact begin to enter into negotiation, seeing that there are at least in the first couple years of the war, first actually 2/3 into the war, they are seeing that their forces are advancing, that they are achieving their military goals, and they feel very confident in themselves. They see that those Arab revolts don't actually haven't yielded anything militarily. What they gain from it, as I just said, is peace, basically, on that stretch of land by the Red Sea, which is all that they needed to keep merchandise and armament flowing to and from India. Hussein had not called himself for the jihad, so Pakistan was still quiet during the war. The British Empire, emboldened by having achieved all of those goals in the conflict that they had set from themselves, they basically feel strong enough to, ignore, forget those letters, the letters they had with Hussein, and instead they engage into negotiation with France and for a little while Russia about what would happen over the post-war territorial division of the remaining Ottoman Empire. They were already seeing victory, and they wanted to negotiate between themselves what they will do with the defunct Ottoman Empire. I said with Russia for a little time because something happens in 1917 in Russia, which is the Bolshevik Revolution. And the October Revolution in Russia turns, the Tsar, the regime of the Tsar is overthrown. A Bolshevik communist government is put in its place, and with that, their first act is to withdraw Russia from participating in the war. They were having obviously internal conflict. The revolution was still unfolding, and so they didn't have any time to devote to fighting a war outside of Russia's own borders. And so what happens is that France and Britain remain alone in dividing the spoils of the not yet won war between themselves. And that becomes known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I'm going to show you the map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement because it is absolutely fascinating how quickly the British forces completely forgot about the letters with Hussein and just did whatever they wanted. Basically, there's no other way. There is no other way to say this. This map that I'm about to share, I'm going to do a quick share screen with the map, and then I'm gonna talk about it. All right. Hopefully you can see the map. Okay. All right. So we have A, B, and C. I'm going to start with what's not A, B, or C. I'm going to start with the top right corner of the map, Armenia. That was still part of the early negotiation with Russia, so that was going to fall under, depending on what was going to happen with the revolution in Russia. That was considered to probably be Russian territory, all of Armenia. C, I'm going to start with C. For some reason, you would thought that at the outset of the war, Italy would gain those territories in this area. As you can see, this was the southern part of Turkey, right there. So that was an interesting inclusion there. What's most important to us is A and B. A was to be, so the dark A was to be direct rule of France. France was going to directly rule over that part of the Middle East that included also part of the southern part of Turkey. And where it says A, circled in blue, but white inside, was going to be a French protectorate, meaning that, they would probably put an Arab ruler there to administer the land or pretend that they ruled over it, but really he was still under French protection. It's a protectorate, right? And that was what's today most of Syria. France would rule over Lebanon. I don't know if you can see, maybe I can make it a little bigger. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah, you can see right here, Tripoli and Beirut. Those are the main cities in Lebanon today, which is why Lebanon to this day has a huge French community, a lot of French speakers, and why there's also a strong Christian Catholic community in that part of the world. B was to be British protectorate, and then British ruled in the east, right? The part that is interesting to us is that little yellow brownish part. As you can see, this part is basically Palestine. If I make it bigger and center it, can we see there Jerusalem here, right? Jaffa here. It's a little bit blurry, and here there is a little red or pink, semicircle there, and that's Haifa and Acre, and that in the agreement was to be for British rule. As you can see, it's the same color, and all the brown Palestine was to be an internationally ruled over by Russia, the British Empire, the French Empire, and even maybe Italy. So that was a Sykes-Picot agreement. What you don't see here at all is any remote design or drawing of any Arab state. That was simply just not included. Nobody bothered. The reason why, and I mentioned that earlier, the British were very insisting on keeping this little semicircle pink dot inside of the multinational rule over Palestine, again, was because, and maybe it will be easier to see here, they wanted to, again, have a railway that would start right here and cross over all of B territory to get all the way down to the Persian Gulf, which you can see here. If you can see my hand, my little hand, is the Persian Gulf is right here. So they would create a railway that would start here, this is a major port. So they would bring goods and stuff to the port of Haifa or Akko, and then they would carry all that all the way to here, which today is Kuwait, and from Kuwait, have another way to transport through the Persian Gulf anything and everything they need to get to India. So that's why they wanted to keep this little red enclave there to themselves. Obviously, they would have to negotiate either with France or with the other powers the right to create that railway to Persia, but that probably was going to be taken care of later on. All right, so that's the map that was drawn still during the war of what would happen after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. All right, let's go back to me. So again, to kind of restate what we were just seeing on the map, you will have it. You will have the map together with the text, the actual text of the agreement. You will have access to both of that. So a few things we see. One, most of Palestine was to be under Allies multinational governance. That was the brown area. Haifa and Acre would remain a British enclave to give Britain naval access and also to facilitate the creation of the railway to the Persian Gulf. Southern Palestine, Transjordan, and part of the Arabian Peninsula would all come under British protection. France would control northern Palestine, including, it wasn't maybe clear on the map, but all the northern part of Galilee, Tzfat, and ultimately even the Golan will be given to France. Lebanon would be French, as well as Syria was to be a French protectorate. Okay, so that's what we saw from that map. Very interesting, how the Middle East was supposed to be divided. Now, when you read the Sykes-Picot Agreement, you will notice one thing. You will notice that the word Jews or the word Jewish is nowhere to be seen. You don't hear anything about Jewish Palestine, and yet, only a year later, after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, only a year later, the British Empire, out of maybe, for most people in the world, out of the blue, the British Empire will publicly promise to establish a Jewish home right there. It is the second of the too many promises made about the promised land, right? We'll see that more of those promises are coming. The first one was to Hussein. The second one seems to be to the Jews. So the promised land, it's really milking its name for all it's worth at this point. Just as there is no mention of the word Jews or Jewish in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we also have noticed that there is nothing that exists in its wording, or as we saw on the map, that makes any reference to Sharif Hussein or the letters that he had exchanged. There is nothing at all. So if Palestine was indeed promised to Hussein in those letters, we can surmise that by now that is very much in doubt, and by now it's far in the rearview mirror of the British Empire. And just as they reneged on their pledge with Hussein almost as soon as the last letter was mailed, so did the British change their mind while the ink was still drying on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Why? Because they had already moved on. They had signed this agreement with the French, and by the time they had signed it, they had already moved on because they realized, and you will read a lot about that in the readings this week, that brown area, that Palestine, absolutely needed to be included in their goals of establishing this buffer zone to the Suez Canal. So suddenly now they had resolved that they were going to rule over the Holy Land. and they had embraced the idea, actually, and you read a lot about that this week, of, from this magnanimous position to bestow the holy sites back to the ancient tribes of Israel, because that for them sounded almost mystically attractive. Like they felt this urge, this mystical urge to be participating in this quasi-biblical turn of history by being the British would be the ones to return Israel's tribes back to the promised land, right? They started to have these ideas of grandeur around this notion, this mystical notion, that they would be the instrument, this biblical instrument to world history. And so, to the great delight of the Zionists, they started to talk to this new leader at the time of the Zionist movement, whose name was Chaim Weizmann. And they started to talk to him about the possibility of a Jewish Palestine. This is going to be expanded in beautiful ways in chapter 4 of Sachar's book that is assigned for this week. One can say that if Israel exists today, it is in no small part thanks to Chaim Weizmann. By the fall of 1917, General Allenby was leading the British forces through the Middle East, and was at the gate of Palestine. On November 2nd, 1917, as the British invasion was taking place, Great Britain issued what is known as the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917. The declaration was viewed with extreme favor, viewed, and that's part of the wording. So I'm quoting from the declaration. The declaration viewed with extreme favor the establishment in Palestine of a national Jewish home for the Jewish people. I mean, at this point, not only had the British Empire completely forgotten about the letters to Hussein and whatever half promise that might have perhaps been, at this point, this declaration, this public declaration, remember that the letters were never made public. This public declaration completely negates whatever Sharif Hussein might have still had in mind as the war was still going on. This is November 1917, so there's another year to the war. And it also flies in the face of the French government, who had just ratified this Sykes-Picot agreement that I just shared with you with the map. But I mean, you can see that Britain was feeling very strong militarily, and they determined that the French were really embattled at their border against the Central Powers, right? This was the time, where the war in the trenches had become horrendous. This was just a few months after Verdun, and so French casualties ultimately will be, they lost like 1 million more soldiers than the British will ever do during the war. And, really the leading force in the Middle East to fight that war was Britain. And so Britain felt that it had really the upper hand in the negotiation and could really run roughshod on whatever, agreement they had. What the British armies needed, since the Arab revolt they were promised had really floundered, that they never amounted to anything. What the British felt that they needed is actually Jewish support. They felt they needed Jewish support in their ongoing war effort. Strategically, they were now seeing in Palestine as a land bridge to the Persian Gulf, as I mentioned, right? But there is another reason that they were interested in securing Jewish support. They were interested in securing Jewish support in this declaration, this Balfour Declaration, for a Jewish homeland, promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And the motivation behind that, it's hard to fathom, but it was really anti-Semitism. Let me explain. The British government came to believe the anti-Semitic notions of Jewish massive wealth and international influence. They came to believe those anti-Semitic canards so much that they used their belief led them to make it policy, foreign policy for the British government. They thought that backing the Jews of Palestine, if they backed the Jews of Palestine, the Jews, the world Jewry would in gratitude donate to the cause, the British cause, and feed the British war chest so that they could, in fact, win the war, and for themselves, really. And they believed that there probably was another Jewish viceman somewhere that would also convince the now communist Russia to stay in the war, right? They thought that the Jews had, diplomatic global tentacles, that they would be able to sway Russia to stay in the war so that they could, they had better chances to win the war. Not only that, but thanks to those Jewish global tentacles, they would be able to pull America into the war. Not only would they be able to pull America into the war, but to convince the Americans to, not be timid about it, to go all in, right? And so they strategically, because of their own anti-Semitism, decided that supporting the Jews was the smart thing to do. And they were most concerned that German Jewish influence would cause the German government to beat the British to the finish line, because the Jews of Germany would convince the Kaiser to make, a Balfour-like declaration before the British could, and therefore gain all the global Jewish, influence to fall to the German Empire instead of them. So it's one of those rare historical occasions where anti-Semitism actually ends up benefiting the Jews. It never really happens, but it's worth noting when it does happen, because that really was the case. So for all the above crazy reasons, and many more, the Balfour Declaration was issued. And I have obviously also included it in this session's readings, so you'll be able to read it for yourself. And I really invite you to read it, and try to really analyze what are the words said here. Read all of those, the letters, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration. It behooves us to see, were there real promises? What were they really promising? Was there real, were they really talking about, where the boundaries was going to be? Or did they really remain vague? Did they actually talk about what would happen to the non-Jews who lived there? Like really look at it from a critical eye and try to make sense of what this now twice promised land really was about, right? Regardless, you can imagine that as the British government intended it, or actually foresaw it, or hoped for in its anti-Semitic forecast, the Balfour Declaration was immediately published in Jewish newspapers worldwide, and it immediately became an international sensation. Understand that in contrast, both the Hussein McMahon letters and the Sykes-Picot Agreement had remained top secret document. So to the world, this was the first time anyone heard anything about what was going on in that part of the world and what might be done with Palestine. So you can also imagine, on the flip side of that, the Jews rejoiced everywhere, but the Arab leadership who knew about the letters were incensed, to say the least, and are arguing that they had been betrayed, that the letters explicitly included Palestine in a future Arab caliphate. Was that, were we betrayed? Was that intentional? Were the British disingenuous with Hussein? Was he taken for a fool? Was he unaware that these words like vilayet meant something different for the Ottoman administration? All of that controversy certainly at that point erupted in the Arab world. And ultimately, also scholars argue, you could say that Hussein didn't deliver on his side of the secret, quote-unquote, agreement that the letters implied. So, yeah, maybe one could argue that the British didn't hold their end of the bargain, but it's also clear historically that the Arab revolt that Hussein promised in quid pro quo, like tit for tat in the letters, also never actually materialized, right? You will read actually in the 6th letter that McMahon actually specifically writes, and I quote, "It is most essential that you should spare no effort to attach all the Arab peoples to our united cause and urge them to afford no assistance to our enemies. It is on the success of these efforts and on the more active measures which the Arabs may hereafter take in support of our cause when the time for action comes, that the permanence and strength of our agreement must depend." Right? But in actuality, those barely 3,000 men of this Arab revolt that overwhelmingly came from Hussein's own forces, they were not able to rally Arabs anywhere else in the Middle East, had only one real victory in their battles, which was the capture of the town of Aqaba by the Red Sea, which is really clearly their neighbor, right? They didn't have to go very far for that. And that town wasn't really defended, right? There was not a lot of Ottoman forces to defend that town. And so, the revolt was quickly in danger of being crushed, actually, by the Ottoman forces. And really would have been crushed without, in fact, the reinforcement of British trained Egyptian officers, French trained Algerian and Moroccan officers, who in fact led the troops, of the revolt, and Britain actually financed the entire attempt, the entire revolt. Like I said, neither the Palestinian nor the Syrian or the Iraqi Arabs ever revolted, right? They sided with the Ottoman Empire. And so, after the war, the British government and McMahon himself denied, in fact, having had any intent to give Palestine to the Arabs, and that he had been intentionally vague by request of the colonial office, and that he didn't want to commit Britain to any future action while the war was still happening. And so the British, with that, the British issued a series of further, post-Balfour declarations. And I have included those in the readings for this week as well, so that you can see how the message evolved in the last months of the war, as the war was coming to a close. Really, the problem for the Arab population of Palestine is that they didn't have any prominent leader to be their voice in the court of the great powers, right? They didn't have a viceman on their side, and even Sharif Hussein, he spoke on behalf of all Arabs, and he was negotiating in his mind on behalf of all Arabs. He was negotiating for Arab independence, right? In his mind, he wanted an Arab, what he called it, an Arab state, but he wanted really an Arab empire that he and his family would rule over, that included all of Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Like he wanted his own post-Ottoman Arab empire, right? And so, he wasn't from Palestine. He was from the Arabian Peninsula, right? He wanted a vast pan-Arabic caliphate, and we will delve into that. But because of that, he never really, well, at first, he didn't oppose the Zionist movement, even after the Balfour Declaration, right? At the peace conference in 1919, so as after the war, his son, I mentioned him, Faisal, he did not demand Arab independence in Palestine. He himself hoped to obtain his own kingdom in Syria. And in fact, Faisal courted Weizmann. He courted Weizmann and he courted the Zionists because he believed that the Jews could help him negotiate to achieve his own purpose. It's quite fascinating. It's rarely told. It's a story that is rarely told. But the highest leadership of the Arab world at the time actually, for a time, allied with the Zionists, recognized the Zionists' movement, their rights to Palestine, and allied with them in order to achieve their own goals, right? They even ratified an agreement. We'll talk about that more next time, but they ratified an agreement with Chaim Weizmann, Faisal. They wrote and signed an agreement with Chaim Weizmann on January of 1919, just before the peace conference. Right? Again, they were not from, the family wasn't, the clan wasn't from Palestine. They were from Mecca, right? So why would they represent the views and aspirations of the Arabs of Palestine that he knew nothing about? To be honest, he knew nothing about. So we'll see. Like historically, Faisal would get what he wanted, which is his kingdom in Syria. But then Then he lost it to the French because the French, didn't agree with him. And now the French controlled completely Lebanon and Syria. And the British controlled completely Palestine and Transjordan. And so ultimately, no Arab independence was on the horizon anymore. And it seemed that the British were going to turn Palestine over to the Jews, even though they were, the population in Palestine was overwhelmingly, the majority was overwhelmingly Arab. So by that point, the Arabs were left feeling betrayed, angry, frustrated, and really fearful of the future. So I'm going to wrap this up, and then we look at some of the questions. There is more to talk about, especially what happened post-war. But I hope I really shared with you all the unfoldings and as it relates to the Zionist movement. And you notice I barely mentioned the Zionist movement at all tonight, because so many pieces that are happening around, and really Palestine itself is, as you will read, that First World War took a real toll on the Jews of Palestine. You will read about it. I don't have time to really expand on this. But yeah, the Jews of Palestine were completely engulfed in that war. So, that's why really the push of the movement turns now to negotiation, and Weizmann takes on that role. Palestine is struggling through the war to survive. You'll read all about it. But I want to, kind of close tonight, maybe with more questions than answers, because I always like to keep those questions, rattling in our minds. I hope I made it clear that what the British have done in those 4 years of the war, with all their fake promises and changes of alliances and the mess they've made, it is clear, I hope by now, that what the British brought about and are now sitting on is a real powder keg of their own devising. They have sown the seeds of discord and violence that already in the years that will follow the war will turn both the Jews and the Arabs of Palestine against them, and eventually the Jews and the Arabs against each other. And so once again, I am left wondering, could it have gone another way? Would the British government, having issued a proclamation for both a Jewish and an Arab homeland in Palestine in 1917, have set the course of history on a different trajectory? Like, if the Balfour Declaration had maybe another one more sentence, right? Couldn't that have completely changed the historical trajectory of Zionism and Palestine, right? If the British Empire had not betrayed Arabs' hopes for independence, if they had in fact ceded territories both to Jews and Arabs at the same time, wouldn't have that made it more palatable to the Arab leadership to let the 55 or so thousand Jews living there at the time hold on perhaps to a few acres of land in Palestine and allow them to call it a state? Because Hussein was like, completely, like, if I can have my pan-Arabic caliphate that would include all that land, He was like, by all means, have your little, few hundred acres. We would be, we will read actually the treaty between Weizmann and Faisal Hussein and Faisal together. And you will see it was like, we like, brothers, we're cousins, of course, we'll be so happy to have the Jews live here with us as long as I can have my, my empire. Absolutely, have at it. That's really kind of the gist of the treaty that Weizmann and Faisal signed together. It is clear to me, and hopefully through your reading this week, you'll see that the British and the French made a mess of the Middle East. It is absolutely clear to me, and I hope it becomes clear to you, that they seeded a conflict, the consequences of which we are feeling still today. So we'll leave it here. We'll leave it at that for tonight. I have not included this in the email you will receive. I think there's 8 different documents there, so that should keep you busy for the week. But if you have, and I hope you have, by now bought this book, One Palestine Complete by Tom Segev, and if you have, spare time on your hand, read the first 5 chapters of this book. They are connected to what I was talking about for this session. The rest, you have the Segev chapter, I think it's 4 or 5, I don't remember now, probably 5, and then all of those documents that I think you're going to delight in reading, like the authentic original documents of the time. It's quite a fascinating history. Okay, let me see if there's any question. That area of Arabia is called the Hejaz. Yeah, the Hejaz kingdom, actually. Why no outcry? Maybe it was related to the letters. I don't know when that was posted. Let me see the time. What was I talking about at 7:30? I don't know. But there was no outcry because, again, those documents were secret. They were never, the population never heard of it. The leadership might have heard of it, but the population never heard of it. And so there was no...
The question was from me, and it had to do with Assad killing millions of people, and there's no outcome.
Yeah, why were there no outcry?
There is the
Yeah.
outcry over Gaza.
That is, yes, I agree with you. It's crazy. Somebody write, is it true that Faisal could not understand what he was signing with Weizmann because Faisal couldn't read English? No, I think those were documents that were very clear to each party. You'll read them. You'll read them yourself. Okay. Good. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope this was enlightening. We don't really ever talk about First World War, but it's so important to our story. To understand all the geopolitical pieces of that incredible puzzle, so we can understand what a mess we inherited from that war and from those empires, and their arrogance, and how they messed everything up, and how we had to live with it, and we still have to live with it today. And it's quite we forget, but it's good to be reminded. Okay, we're going to close tonight, as always, with our Shalom chant. We enter with peace and we leave with peace. Such is our practice. And so, inviting you to close your eyes for just a just a moment and find your breath again. And if you want to chant with me, draw a breath for shalom. 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 Thank you.
תודה רבה.
בבקשה.
Udani. Udeoni.
Good.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.
You bet. As always, brilliant.
Thank you.
And left me with one more book to order.
Yes.
Great class. Great class, Olivier. Thank you. Good
You're
to be
welcome.
with you. Amazing learning. Thanks.